Good afternoon, or good morning, depending on which time zone you're in. On behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, welcome to another webinar in the Institutional Repository Series. I'm Pamela Blue, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenter this afternoon is Brad Matthies, the Head of Access Services at Butler University. Brad is also the Project Manager for the Butler Digital Commons. He is a member of the Resource Sharing Committee of the Academic Libraries of Indiana and serves as chair of their Open Access Subcommittee. In his presentation entitled Challenge the Status Quo, When the IR Comes to Access Services, Brad shares ideas on how librarians can take on new projects such as the implementation and management of an institutional repository without compromising other critical library services. If you have questions for Brad, please type them into the question box on your screen. At the conclusion of his presentation, he will answer as many questions as time permits. Any questions which are not answered during the Q&A session will be answered offline and the responses sent to all attendees. Today's session will be recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording at the conclusion of the webinar, together with a copy of Brad's slides. Now, as I turn the presentation over to Brad, there may be a slight delay.
Okay, it looks like we made the transition. So before I get started, I first would like to thank ALCTS for inviting me to have a conversation with all of you today. And before we get started, I'll give you a little background about myself. Of course, I'm the head of access services here at Butler University Libraries. I'm also the project manager for our digital commons. And as far as the agenda goes today, and let me pause for a second. There we are. As far as the agenda goes for today, to frame the discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about Butler University Libraries. I do want to emphasize why libraries are changing and why it's important for various departments to really reevaluate what it is they're doing. I will talk about some assessment of services here at Butler University, which led to the Access Services Department actually being involved with an institutional repository, which may seem odd to some. I'm going to discuss how this service evolved, and within the context of this part of the presentation, those of you that are here for staffing ideas or re-envisioning staffing, especially from a small to medium-sized library perspective, there should be some good information in that section for you. And I will conclude with some final thoughts, sort of the takeaways from this presentation. So before we get started, one of the themes that you're going to hear me talk about throughout the presentation is assessment and reassessment. I'm a firm believer in data-driven decision-making, so I do not generally like to take on an initiative unless we have really studied it and we have some good data. I've seen a lot of mistakes by other librarians, both here at Butler, but even we could talk nationwide, who will start an initiative, just because it's the next latest and greatest thing, and usually that ends in disaster. So one of the takeaways is to reinforce, data-driven decision making. And on that note, before I get started, I do have a few quotes pertaining to the status quo. The first one comes from the former Vice President Al Gore. Those who have a vested interest in the status quo will probably continue to stifle any meaningful change. This particular quote actually resonated well with what had happened in Access Services. Luckily, at least within my department, I did not have anyone who was arguing, for the status quo. Now, we could broaden it out to the Butler University libraries, and I did have a few staff or librarians that gave me the curious eyebrow once they learned we were going to take on something that traditionally falls into, the realm of technical services. But at the end of the day, it was a successful initiative, and I have won them over since. Also, since it is an election season and in an effort to remain bipartisan, if there are any Republicans in the crowd, I thought I would include a quote from Ronald Reagan. Status quo, is Latin for the mess we're in. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the former president. The status quo is something certainly that you have to consider when implementing change. It doesn't necessarily have to mean it's a mess. At least that has been my experience. And then, of course, last but not least, if you're neither Democrat or Republican, I included a quote from George Carlin, who says it as only Mr. Carlin could say. Essentially, the status quo sucks. Depending on the day, sometimes I might agree with George Carlin, but for the most part, the Al Gore at least captures my experience. So anyway, enough of the quotes. Let's transition into the actual presentation, and hopefully I did not offend your political sensibilities with my curious sense of humor. Let's start the discussion by just telling you a little bit about Butler University and the libraries, just to give you context. We are a private liberal arts institution, approximately 4,000 students. We have 12 full-time faculty librarians. We do have the rank of faculty. We currently do not have tenure, but a couple years down the road, that may actually be the next phase in our evolution. 13 full-time staff, and within my department, I have access to 10 to 15 student workers depending on the year. A little bit about our digital commons. Since the inception in 2008, we've gathered over 4,000 objects, archived 2 journals. We're actively publishing 2 journals. In the fall of 2011, we unveiled our first scholarly journal, which we're actively publishing. It's the Journal of Hindu Christian Studies, and it's also a collaboration with Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Butler and the University of Notre Dame. And then, of course, within the Digital Commons, there's a product called Selected Works, which are essentially profile pages. At Butler, we actually took that on as a service, and my team will build Selected Works pages on behalf of faculty members. I mention that because that has turned out to be probably one of our signature services that has generated really a lot of good press and goodwill for the libraries on campus with faculty. And one thing that I would point out, throughout this whole process of transforming my department to support this, I really have never had more than half of a full-time employee at any given time. Part of the reason I've been able to do this is I've distributed the workload across several FTE, and actually I reevaluated their positions and what it is they're doing. And that's a suggestion you're going to hear me make throughout the presentation. Even if you're a small to medium-sized library, I think if you reassess what your staff is doing, you might be surprised at the results and what you actually could take on. So another theme which relates directly to what happened to us here at Butler I do think that libraries are changing, and if you follow the library literature or library blogs, this is a fairly common theme. Even at ALA, you'll see presentations on this. Depending on who you're talking to, they'll rattle off any number of reasons why. My personal opinion is that most of the change that we're seeing is due to the 2 points that I have up on the screen: technology and budget cuts. Now, within the context of what happened here at Butler University, our budget has been pretty good. We've been to the edge, but I've not faced any budget cuts, which is a good thing. What really has driven a lot of the change that I'll be talking about is technology. So just kind of file that away in the back of your heads for now. And to talk just a little bit more about change, I'm going to cite some things David Lewis said in 2010. He predicted a few trends. One is a decline in non-professional and student staffing. He also predicts a decrease in professional staff with MLS degrees and actually a transition to other professional degrees. The one, though, that really resonates with me is his prediction of an increase in merged service points, or we could call it transforming or blended service points. We have seen that both in access services here at Butler University and also in our reference department, and those are points I'll talk about. Incidentally, I do have a citation slide at the end of this presentation, so please, do not worry about taking notes or writing down this particular book. I cited the David Lewis chapter, but I would highly recommend The Expert Library if you have not read it. It's a really good book. There's different chapters by different authors, and they cover both technical services as well as public services. So I've really gotten a lot out of this book. So that's just a shameless plug. If you have not read it, I would encourage you to do so. So, my personal opinion, the technological changes and economic climate really are forcing many libraries to revision service points as well as staffing. Just a few examples. It's fairly common now to see branch libraries being closed either due to budget cuts or technological changes, and that's pretty much a nationwide trend. Here at Butler, for example, we retired our reference desk and we replaced it with something that's called the Information Commons. It is staffed by students who are actually trained in traditional reference and academic technology. This is a partnership with our Center for Academic Technology on campus, and the students are actually in a program. When they graduate, they'll get a certificate at the end of their 4 years, which will be a nice little boost to whatever major they're having. As far as reference, we have moved to a triage system. So essentially, if the students can't handle the question, there are on-call librarians, or if they're not in the building, the students will arrange an appointment. A little closer to home here in Indiana, Indiana State University was unfortunately hit by some budget cuts. Their interlibrary loan department had to reduce staffing from 5 to 2, and they had to double their student support hours. And last but not least, on the national level, you've all probably heard about the reorganizations at Harvard as well as at the University of San Diego. These are only 2 examples. Probably in the last 2 years, I've seen half a dozen major staff reorganizations, and I personally can trace that back again to either technological changes or the economic climate. So, I'm sort of making my case that, if by now, if you don't think libraries are changing, I think there is more than enough evidence. So the question now becomes, what do we do about it? Access services at Butler. I have been here since 2001, I have been in the role of head of access services for approximately 6 years. Access services, the staffing that you see on this particular slide, including the hours, that has been in place since at least 2001. And I think with circulation, we could probably take it back to the 1990s. So, you know, this number of workers as well as the number of hours per week is based on a demand that was in place in 2001. But what happened shortly after I came into my position is I started analyzing some data, and I'm going to share some of that with you, and that sort of led into revisioning our department. The first one, and you know, this is probably fairly common nationwide, I would suspect, we started to look at our circulation statistics. You can see the top bar is our Irwin Library, which is our main library. Starting in 2005, we had, you know, approximately 27,000 circulations. That number has dropped to 16,000, and it continues to drop. A slide that I would have liked to include, but it would have put me over limit, is the use of our electronic resources, which has actually increased. So it's not as if people are not using the library and its resources, they're just using them in a different way. But the important thing about this slide is, again, going back to my staffing, you know, we were staffing that a service point based on, you know, 27,000 circulations, but that demand is no longer there. So that leads to some questions, which I will talk about. The more drastic slide is our reserve statistics, and I have to apologize for this slide. Actually, the bar on the left-hand side, the vertical bar that goes from 10 to 70, that represents number of faculty. So, you know, the 70 would mean 70 faculty members are using that service. You can see in 2006, we had approximately 60 faculty members using both print and electronic reserves. And since then, you know, it has steadily dropped. In fact, e-reserves has plummeted to the point of, when I last looked at the statistics, we have approximately 2% of Butler faculty using e-reserves. The reason for this is scanning technology has become very affordable. So most departments on campus have their own scanners. Many faculty have their own scanners. What that means is they are now scanning their own material and uploading it to Blackboard themselves. So they effectively took our e-reserves operation out of the equation. And in fact, this summer we plan to retire our e-reserves because it really doesn't make sense to keep expending money on our subscription for Docutech. Also, just a little interesting aside, approximately 2010 and 2011, we started having conversations with faculty in the Faculty Senate, preparing them for the fact that e-reserves was going to be retired, and that resulted in a spike in print reserves. So we sort of surmised that this is probably those holdout faculty members that will not utilize the technology, and so they're just shifting to print reserves, and we have no intention of canceling our print reserve service. So as a department head, you know, I was faced with the proverbial fork in the road, and I really had two choices. One, you know, the staff were just simply not as busy as they used to be, so I could reduce staffing. Again, I'm fortunate that I wasn't forced to reduce staffing because of budget reasons, but I will be honest and say that I came very close to cutting our student hours in half, and probably cutting the students down to approximately 7 or 8 students instead of the usual 15. But I'm really glad that I did not do that because I would not be able to support the digital commons. So after talking to library administration, we looked at our strategic plan, and we looked at some areas, you know, that the library has wanted to pursue, And we ended up repurposing staff and student workers to support a digital initiative, or at least one piece of our digital initiative, which is the Butler Digital Commons. We also have a Content DM image gallery. That is still managed through technical services, and that's a separate project from our digital commons. But we thought that this would be a good fit for access services, so that's where it ultimately ended up. Now, before I get into the sort of the nitty-gritty of workflows and all of that, if you're at a library and you actually do reassess a service, or if you're thinking about reassessing a service or even implementing something new, anytime you do that, it creates a lot of change, and change is notorious for creating a lot of anxiety in librarians and staff and even student employees. And so in preparing for this presentation, I sort of reflected and chatted with some of my circulation staff. I ended up generating a list of just general tips that I think will help you manage change. At least they certainly made the transition go nicely here at Butler. Of course, the first one is, simply communicate and actually be able to articulate to the staff why this change is happening and why it's valuable. Our project related to the university, to the library, and also to the staff members. That having been said, I'm under no illusion that every staff member, plans to be a librarian and is passionate about libraries and wants to retire working at a library, although we do have some of those. But at the very least, you're probably going to be able to relate why, this new skill set is valuable to them. For example, some of my staff members are pursuing MLS degrees, and they actually hope to be librarians. So from, the resume standpoint, being involved with a digital initiative that's very high profile is going to be beneficial to them. So that's sort of my hook or buy-in for my staff. Another thing that I would recommend, whether you're a department head or a manager, really familiarize yourself with the change before expecting your staff to take it on. In fact, you're going to hear me talk about how I learned the entire process from scanning to uploading to everything in between before I started teaching it to staff members. And not only did this alleviate anxiety, but it made it a lot easier for me to parcel out portions of our digital commons to the staff members. These next few bullet points, I probably could have just lumped under transparency and communication. And this is a mistake that, I see a lot on this campus, and I have colleagues across the country that, work at other libraries. Administration will decide to make some sort of change, but it really doesn't get communicated very well, and then staff react in a negative way. If the evolutionary biologists are correct, we're supposed to be pattern-seeking animals, and if staff do not have enough information, they'll build their own patterns or they'll fill in the blanks, and a lot of times, what they surmise in their own brains is totally the opposite of what's actually happening. So if one thing I can't stress enough is just be honest and as transparent as possible. Doing that here really did alleviate a lot of the anxiety. My staff members in particular, when I met with them in preparation for this presentation, that's one of the things that they said to me. So I can't emphasize that enough. And again, getting back to data-driven decision-making, you'll hear me beat this quite literally to death, but assess, assess, assess. There are many ways that you can go about doing this. One such way is a method called the Deming cycle. This is sort of a classic in business and operations management. It's been around for a long time, and it's actually really simple. Whoops. His method that he developed is simply 4 steps: plan, do, check, and act. And he eventually revised it and replaced check with study. And I do agree with that. That's actually important because when you actually study the results, then you can take the next logical step and make changes if need be. One little caution regarding this, and you'll probably hear me say this again at the end of the presentation, one thing that librarians are notoriously good about is details. That's a strength, but it can also be a weakness in that a lot of times we get hung up on the planning, and we suffer from the proverbial paralysis by analysis. So, one thing that I would stress, no matter what initiative it is you're planning to implement, could be a digital initiative, something in public services, some planning is good, but eventually you just have to let go and turn the initiative on. We learned a lot actually from our mistakes, so I think it's more valuable to make the mistakes and go back through the process than to get stuck on planning so much that you don't get the initiative off the ground. So changing gears here, the next series of slides we're going to talk about really how this new service evolved in Access Services. And as I talk through the next series of slides, what I'm going to have to do is give you a snapshot over a period of years, and you're going to see me talk a lot about, or actually hear me talk a lot about, assessment throughout the process. So we started planning for this in July of 2008. The Digital Commons went live in November. So for that first period, the initial content that we had was a discontinued journal series, and then we had hoped to start gathering faculty contributions. As far as the staffing goes, I was it. And this was actually a purposeful decision. It goes back to one of my earlier slides. I wanted to learn the entire process, from scanning all the way to uploading before I started passing this on to my staff. So this is just an estimate of about how much time I was spending. And then I was fortunate in that we already had scanning expertise based on interlibrary loan and also our e-reserves operation. And after assessing, what my staff was actually doing along with some data, I did have the ability to adjust staff workloads, and ultimately I ended up rewriting all of their positions. So assessment for the end of this period, the hands-on project management, was a success. It allowed me to set reasonable goals for my team. It allowed me to learn the process, but I'm like any other librarian, especially at a small to medium-sized institution. I wear a lot of different hats, so this was not sustainable long-term. I could not keep up this pace. And as far as content, the biggest revelation for this period, we actually beta tested the selected works profile pages with some of our faculty members who are very receptive to technology. And the pages just were not being built. And the faculty really were not giving us content. And ultimately, we determined that really it's not the faculty members' fault, and it wasn't even the Digital Commons product, because the product is really easy to use. After chatting with faculty members, they're even busier than librarians. And so in, the halo of things that they have to do, building a selected works page was way down on the bottom of the list. So I made the recommendation that we would take this on as a service, and actually that turned out to be a great success. So our next phase, January 2009 until about July of 2009, we finished scanning the botanical studies. We started scanning, or actually started publishing an active journal. Actually, this is more of a scholarly magazine. And once we started promoting and marketing selected works as a service, faculty contributions started coming in, actually at one point at a rate that almost buried us for a second, but it equaled out eventually. Staffing for this period, you'll notice that my time started to reduce to about 8 hours a week. And I really started transitioning into, what I should be doing, which is project management. I was teaching people how to use the system, but I started really moving into marketing and getting out on the campus, pressing palms, meeting with people, attending faculty meetings, just trying to promote our digital commons. At this point, I had only trained one circulation staff, and she was helping with journal publishing. I folded 2 student workers into the process, and I was very fortunate to have an MLS intern from Indiana University. She helped us develop the selected works process. So, going back to that Deming cycle, assessment for this period, or actually studying for this period, insofar as staffing, the thing that stands out was actually that intern. And again, I really got lucky because we got a really outstanding intern from IU. She developed the entire process. I revised it, and then I taught it to my staff. And one of the things you'll hear me talk about at the end of the presentation, but I like to empower staff so that they get a vested interest in what it is they're doing. So I allow them, they have a blank check if they want to revise the process. If they can get from point A to B better than I can, more power to them. And that's what I've let them do. So they have since revised this process even more. The biggest lesson learned, and for those of you that are veterans in digital repositories, this is probably old news, but if you're considering or thinking about taking on something like this, this might be new to you. But our biggest lesson is you really need to balance content against available staffing. I'll talk more about this at the end of the presentation as well. For now, suffice to say that continuous publishing really will drain human resources. Any project that staff are continually going to have to help create and upload and maintain really will drain resources. So you have to be careful there. So eventually, the Deming cycle transformed into what I'm jokingly calling the Matthies cycle, although I highly doubt 10 years from now people are going to be reading about this. But this is essentially the process that we follow now for every piece of content. Also, what I refer to as basic training, I sort of stole an idea from the military, which is, all my staff and student employees and volunteers get trained on a basic set of skills. And that has made it very easy to adjust to workflows and new projects and increased workloads. But everything we do starts from content. So I identify the content. Staff are trained on a common skill set, so it's really easy for me to parcel out assignments to my staff. Always assign a completion date with a goal. If you do not tell staff what you want done, they're going to go their own way, and then it may not get done. So a completion date with a goal is valuable. While they're working on it, I'll typically assess, and then I'll meet with them for sure when they complete the project, and we'll assess again. At this point, if everything worked, we won't change anything. If there's lessons learned, or if staff have a better idea of how to make the process work, at this point we'll change, and then we start the whole cycle over again. So again, belaboring the point, or risking belaboring the point, I can't stress enough assessment. The Deming cycle, the Matthies cycle, develop your own cycle, really assessing thoughtfully has really helped grow our project and make it manageable for staff. And it also helped us develop what I call a distributed workload, which I'll talk about here too. So eventually the evolution ended with staffing here in the present. And finally I'm at where I should be, which is the project manager. Occasionally I'll still go into the trenches with them, and I might build a selected works page, or if there's a particular upload, I may make an upload. But most of my time now is spent engaging faculty through a variety of means, and actually also engaging various units on campus. Anything from formal presentations to one-on-one meetings. I have an e-newsletter that goes out to a subscriber list, so on and so forth. I now have a permanent Digital Commons team. I rewrote all of their positions, so officially within their circulation duties they have Digital Commons duties, and this is just a rough breakdown. One person devoted to journal publishing and selected works, one person totally devoted to the faculty profile pages, and then one person focusing on thesis work. And I even have a student Digital Commons team, again, trained in basic training or that basic skill set, scanning PDF preparation, and I actually let them do some limited uploading, and this is a point I'll be talking about also here. And I should just make a disclaimer, and this is mainly for the small to medium-sized libraries out there. There are times when we're not in production, so it's conceivable with a project like this, once you really start looking at what your staff are doing, you really analyze the data, you would probably be surprised what staff is spending their time on and how much more they could take on. And again, this is not a continual everyday project. There are phases where we're deep into production, and then there could be 2 or 3 weeks or even a month where we're not in production. So again, if you're a small to medium-sized library, don't let something like this scare you, because I bet you'll be surprised. Just sort of a pictorial pie chart representation of the time spent as a project manager on this. And this is representative of my time estimate. So you can see that first 6 months, it was a little bit rough, but after about a year, I got into that nice green zone where a project manager should be. And of course, one thing that we've been able to do is achieve scalability. The system that I have in place is very reactive. So if we get new content, we're easily able to integrate that into the workflows. And I credit, again, stealing from the military, just the notion of basic training. That really makes it easy. When I know what staff are capable of doing, when someone comes to me with a new project or a new piece of content, I can almost immediately assign it to a staff member, and I know that I won't even probably have to spend any time training, that they'll just start doing it. Also, the bpress web interface, I'm less familiar with some of the other institutional repository platforms out there, but one nice thing about the bpress interface is it has the ability to add and remove administrators from various series. So if you have content that you want to protect, students, you can make it so they don't have access. But there may be content that is suitable for students to upload. It's very easy to add a student employee, to one of the series within the Digital Commons platform, and I think that also really has helped us. Scalability is good, but you also want sustainability. And I talked about this at the beginning. I'll go into it in a little greater depth here. Really, when it comes to an institutional repository, I discovered 2 main types of projects. You have the terminal and you have the ongoing. Ongoing projects really drain staff time. Sort of the bitter irony in all of this, at least at Butler, is the ongoing projects are the ones that we have gotten the most play out of, whether it's regionally or on campus, with faculty, with students, with alum. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, unfortunately, but you really have to be careful about how many ongoing projects you take on. We have staff that are actively involved publishing journals. We gather faculty contributions. We build pages. And if we're not careful, I actually could over-tap the system that I have in place or overextend it. So again, for those of you new to institutional repositories and considering this, just be aware that you need to select your content very carefully based on your staffing. Ultimately, I do think, again, after assessment, my basic training model, I was able to achieve what I call Zen, which basically is staying sane throughout this whole process. We have the ability to add new projects. We're maintaining the old ones. I do not have staff or students rioting. In fact, they're very happy being involved in this process. And as a project manager, I'm in that sweet spot and have been able to stay sane. So at least for me, Deming and some of the other stuff that I've shared with you already really has made this a great project for Access Services. And speaking of Denning, I promised I was going to belabor this point. I can't emphasize enough, doing some sort of assessment. We can keep it as simple as the Deming method: plan, do, study, and act. And when I was thinking about this, I probably had at least 12 examples I could share with you. This example actually came about in the last month, and I was talking with our Associate Dean for Technical Services, Josh Petrusa, and he's new to Butler. This is his second year, and it's always good to get a fresh look at a project, which is another little tip I would give the audience. But sort of going through this process with him, in the context of our theses, we were actually, after a particular thesis was uploaded to the Digital Commons, we had a workflow in place with technical services. So it would pass from access services to technical services, and cataloging would catalog the persistent URL in our classic library catalog. But in August, we moved to a discovery service called Primo, and I'm sure most of you have heard of it. Well, Digital Commons is OAI compliant, so Primo is harvesting all of our content. So going through just, plan, do, and especially after we studied, the ultimate decision turned out to be, do we need to be cataloging that e-link if, in fact, we're really moving away from our classic catalog and really promoting our Primo? We finally decided just to stop the practice. So what we've done, just by a little bit of assessment, is actually free up staff time in 2 departments. And that's just one little small example of, the value of constantly reassessing what your staff does, at least on a yearly basis. And speaking of student employees, when I talk to librarians or even library staff, and actually some faculty on campus here, and they realize that we actually have student employees involved with a digital initiative, I usually get one of 2 reactions. One reaction is represented by that young lady on the top right, the model student, and the person will essentially say, oh, that's great, what a wonderful opportunity. But then we have those folks on campus or within librarianship that have had bad experiences with student employees. That's represented by the young man on the bottom left. And total aside, this is actually Microsoft clip art. So I was surprised they had a student that I could use as a representation for my proverbial bad student. But the one thing that I want to really stress is not to be afraid of integrating student employees into library processes. It really has been a success for us at Butler within Access Services. When we hire a student employee, we actually interview them, not to the level that we would interview a circulation assistant or even a librarian, but if you do your due diligence, you're going to be able to find responsible students and avoid that young man here on the bottom left-hand side. And also, just to be fair, I'm sure there are some young women out there that have not been good students as well. That having been said, if you do involve student workers, whether it's due to budget cuts, and you have no choice, or maybe it's because you want to expand a service, I do have some things to consider, just for you to consider based on my experience. Definitely you're going to want to assess each project against, the skill set that your students have. And, if we look at our 2 digital initiatives here at Butler, the first one is Content DM. It's our image collection. It needs comprehensive metadata, high quality scans, definitely need a specialist librarian involved. So I would be very hesitant to involve undergraduate students with that project. If we had suitable graduate students, especially someone with, working toward an MLS, this would be a good project. But how we're using our digital commons, it turned out to be a perfect fit for student employees. The metadata standards needn't be as robust. Scanning requirements are moderate. Really, most of what we're scanning has been published elsewhere, so we just need a scan that can be read online or possibly printed off. Digital Commons interface, in my opinion, is made for students because it's really easy to learn. And most of our content, the content that I'll let students work with is not the high-profile content. So I'm not going to, for example, I'm not going to let a student worker build our provost's selected works page. But, uploading, historical Butler theses, yeah, probably. And, something that I can't emphasize enough also, really don't get hung up on the mistakes. And again, this sort of goes back, to something that makes librarians librarians. We're very detail-oriented, and we take pride in perfection. But unfortunately, I think sometimes we take it to the extreme, and it translates into how we manage other people. Ultimately, we're not recalibrating a nuclear reactor. We're not working in an emergency room. So if a mistake is made, nothing too terrible is going to happen. Most of the mistakes are correctable. As an example of that, I would cite Holly Mossman at Indiana State University. I mentioned her earlier in the presentation. Due to budget cuts, she had to actually integrate student employees into her interlibrary loan operation to maintain the level of service that they had developed. Did the mistakes increase? Yeah, definitely. Did it ruin their operation? No. She still runs probably one of the top interlibrary loan operations in the state of Indiana, at least. Also, incidentally, when this PowerPoint becomes available, the link to Holly's name here will take you out to her presentation on her experience with integrating student employees into interlibrary loans. So you might want to take a look at that. But within the context of our digital commons, have we seen mistakes? Sure. Typos, duplicate uploads, really basic stuff. But a little dirty secret here. Some of the mistakes that we've seen, I've seen librarians make, and I've seen library staff make. In fact, when I was learning the process, I made some of those mistakes. So again, really to underscore, mistakes are going to happen, but you can always go back in and edit a record. As long as you have, someone in place whose job it is to occasionally sample your uploaded content and look for mistakes, you're going to be fine. So this takes us really to the concluding thoughts, and these are sort of the takeaways. If you remember nothing else about what I said, these are the points that I would like you hopefully to remember. Merged service points, based on what I have read, basically change is already arrived in our profession. There's no getting around it. I've known some librarians that react very negatively to the change. I am of the mindset that, we need to embrace it and just re-envision what it is we do as a profession. For access services and for me, personally, embracing change was very positive. When I got into librarianship, and especially when I took the head of access services position here at Butler, if someone would have told me I'm going to be managing an institutional repository, I would have laughed. But this has really been a positive experience for me because it has allowed me to work very closely with the folks up in technical services, and I've actually gained a new appreciation for digital librarians, but also, you know, catalogers and all of the other technical services folk, and I think that's a two-way street. Also, between the two departments, you know, again, we're a small to medium-sized library. We, I think, sort of working as a team, two departments, probably have reached the point where Butler in the next couple of years is going to need a digital librarian. So I suspect there's going to be some, you know, reorganization going on here, and I really think that's a good thing, and I'm just glad I could be a part of helping that process along. Again, you know, going back to what librarians are good at, details are good, but please do not get too hung up on them. You can always adjust project plans. You can correct mistakes. Again, we're not working in an emergency room, so if there's a small metadata error or, you know, a bad page scan, it can be fixed. It's not the end of the world. And I really highly, you know, encourage you to consider using student employees, and maybe at a level that you're not used to using them. It's been very successful here at Butler, and actually the Career Services Center tells us at Butler that, you know, part of our job as student managers is to actually educate students on how to be good employees. And I'm not trying to disrespect some of the jobs that our circulation workers do, but looking at this from the perspective of a hiring employer out there in the world of work, if I have a student telling me, okay, I was a circulation assistant and my job duties were to shelve books, shelf read, and sit at a desk and sometimes check out books, you know, I would think, okay, that's interesting. But if I had a student employee that told me, you know, hey, I was involved with the Butler University Digital Commons, here's the website, you can see the series that I worked on, and then they start listing off all the stuff that they were able to do, who do you think is going to get hired? So from the perspective of helping our students and also really filling in a staffing shortage at a smaller or medium-sized library, please consider student employees. One of my graduates, Mackenzie, who graduated last year, I had her very deeply involved in the digital commons, and she's not going into librarianship. She's working for a nonprofit charity doing their social media. And when I chatted with her boss, who called me for a reference, I talked at length about the responsibilities she had with our digital commons. Now, can I say that got her the job? Probably not. But I think it certainly influenced the boss, because she did get the job, and she's dealing with this particular organization's social media. So, you know, again, don't be afraid of student employees. If you hire them logically, you will be able to find some good ones, and they can do a lot more than you think. And before I conclude, as promised, here is the suggested reading slide. Highly encourage you to look at the Expert Library. It really is one of the most valuable books I think I've read in a long time from the ALA. There's chapters in there by various authors. I cite the Lewis chapter in this citation, but again, technical services and public services, a lot of good stuff. Does talk about change, so that could make some people nervous, but you know, ultimately I think change is happening. I'm of the mindset that we need to embrace it. Insofar as the Deming model, again, that's a classic in the business world, so you probably could Google it and find enough information. But if you're interested in the two books that I read many years ago, I listed those. There is some valuable information in there, and again, he's a classic in the business world. So with that, this really concludes the presentation. Before I turn control back over and we start answering some questions, I first want to again thank the audience for taking the time out of their day to listen to me talk, and I also want to thank ALCTS for inviting me to speak. Hopefully my presentation was useful, and hopefully you can take one or two things away and maybe bring it back to your own operation. So with that, I'm going to conclude the presentation and wait for the transition.
Hi, Brad. Thanks very much. We are starting to get a few questions, so I'm going to read them out, and if you could respond, we'll have a few minutes for questions before the end of the program. First
Okay.
question, have you formally changed student job descriptions, and are those posted in a public area?
I have not formally changed student job descriptions yet. We have our student job descriptions, written in a generic enough manner that, at least for Butler University, and this could be different, if you're a public university, there may be additional guidelines, but ours are generic enough that it's easy enough for me to fold our student employees into this. We have two classifications of student employees currently. One is the circulation worker, and one, I think the title is like technical services worker. When I fold a student into our digital commons, we switch them to that technical service pay grade, which is essentially a dime more. One thing that I do plan to do this summer, actually, because we have a new dean who will be taking over the library, I do want to have a conversation with her, because actually at this point our student employees, some of them are doing so much that they really deserve a higher pay grade. So I need to start working through the politics of that to make it happen, but at present, no.
All right, another question. For the selected work service, do you add and modify content for faculty as well, or just the initial setup?
For the selected work service, we will build the page. We have template emails that we communicate to the faculty members. So one of the things we tell them in that email is if they have any changes throughout the year, contact someone on the team and we will make the updates. And then typically what I do, it's about in the beginning of December when faculty activity reports are due, is I will send out one or two emails to the faculty listserv, and also I work through the associate provost office, Laura Bailing, who has direct oversight of faculty, and what we do is we solicit for new CVs. I will also solicit here in April before the faculty basically scatter to the four corners of the planet to get new CVs. So really, to answer your question, we do the updates. The updates are the easy part, actually. It's the initial setup that takes a little time, and investigating permissions and all of that.
All right, another question. Do you have a special collections department, and how were they involved, if you have such a department?
Yes, we do have a special collections department, and actually, if you look within our digital commons, we have a community that's devoted to them. How they were initially involved is we had a librarian that actually a reference librarian who was looking for a project, and she started talking to the special collections librarian, and it turned out to be our yearbook project. So it was that person in coordination with our special collections librarian who digitized and uploaded the Butler yearbooks, which have been very popular. This semester, once I finally have my student employees at a place where I want, I started scheduling. There's a student employee up in special collections. I started folding her into the scanning workflow. We actually, over the summer, purchased a scanner from ATIZ, which will do archival quality scanning. And actually, if you're looking for a scanner, I would recommend the company. The scanner's great because it can do low-end scanning or high-end scanning. So we started folding that student employee into the whole process, and so far everything has gone swimmingly.
I have a question here about metadata. What input form for metadata do you use, and who does the metadata input?
Well, within Digital Commons, I'm trying to think. I think they use Dublin Core. I'd have to check on that. But, you know, basically the Digital Commons platform, if you need to do some very high-end metadata, Berkeley Electronic Press can customize the form to about whatever you want. But we are relying mostly on, you know, the fact that that Digital Commons content gets harvested, you know, through OAI, through Google, through that sort of thing. So it's really using, I think, metadata in a different way. Also, the internet web bots will crawl all the way down to the PDF level. So our PDFs, you know, we have to go through the OCR text recognition. So really for our Digital Commons, the metadata requirements do not have to be all that high, but that's how we're using it. We generally use the basic template for whatever series that happens to be developed. Now, the folks that are dealing with the content DM, they have to do the high-end metadata and cataloging. That's a different project. But as far as who is doing the basic metadata, my staff or myself, I have had some student employees who I've let do some of that as well. But really, if you're a cataloger or a digital librarian and you took a look at, you know, the backside of what we're doing, it's nothing too drastic. And we still do a phenomenal amount of downloads and people can still find content. So it might be unique to us, but it works.
Thanks, Brad. We have a few more questions, but we're really just about out of time. So what I'd like to ask you to do is we have logged the questions in the question log. If you wouldn't mind answering them in writing,
yeah,
and then we'll send them out to everyone when we send out the recording information about the recording or about with your slides. Is that okay?
Yep, no problem.
Great. All right. So I think we're going to try to wrap up now and I'll turn the program back for one more slide. And let me say thank you to Brad for all the excellent techniques and tips he provided on juggling multiple responsibilities while also showcasing the institutional repository. As I mentioned earlier, later this afternoon or tomorrow morning, you will receive a short online evaluation form about today's webinar. We hope you will take a few minutes to fill it out and return it to us. The ALCTS Continuing Education Committee values your comments and uses them in planning and shaping additional continuing education offerings on the topic of institutional repositories as well as on an array of other subjects. If you have an idea for a webinar, we would love to hear from you. We are currently beginning to schedule webinars for the second half of 2012. So this is an excellent time to think about what you might like to present or recommend somebody who could present something. You may contact me at pblue@umaryland.edu or submit a proposal using the form found on the ALCTS website. The spring webinar schedule is full, and I just draw your attention to a number of events scheduled in the coming weeks, including 2 free webinars in conjunction with Preservation Week coming up in a couple of weeks in April. As we sign off this afternoon, I would like to thank Felicity Dykes and Iping Chen Gaffey, members of the CE Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee, and Alyssa Novak and Julie Reese in the ALCTS office for their assistance. And thank you to all our attendees for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to welcoming you at another ALCTS webinar in the future.